6:47 in the morning, and you are standing in the kitchen with your phone in your hand, the message already typed, the cursor blinking at the end of a sentence you have read 4 times. You do not send it. You put the phone face down on the counter, then pick it up again, then set it down a second time, harder than you meant to. The coffee goes cold before you touch it. This is not the first morning like this one. It will not be the last, not unless something in you changes before the year does. You have built an entire private architecture around almost doing things, almost applying, almost asking, almost leaving, almost starting. Somewhere along the way, without ever deciding to, you traded the life you wanted for the life you could explain to other people. And the strange part is how reasonable every single one of those trades looked in the moment it was made. What you are about to walk through will not hand you a plan. Plans have never been your problem. You have drawers full of them. What it will hand you is a way of seeing the exact moment where you keep stepping back from your own life, so precisely that you will not be able to unsee it afterwards. That is the only kind of change that ever holds. Here is the thing nobody has told you yet. The thing that will not make sense until it does. You have never once been waiting for the right conditions. You have been waiting for permission to stop being afraid, and no external condition was ever going to grant you that. The conditions were never the obstacle. You were. Based on the book The Magic Story by Frederic Van Rensselaer Dey, and adapted into narrative format to make its ideas practical and engaging. Chapter 1. The Sentence. You keep not finishing. A quiet morning, a small hesitation. The first sign that something has been happening to you for years without your permission. You know this morning, not this exact one, but its shape. The alarm goes off and your body is already awake, has been awake for a while, lying there in the dark doing the math on a day that has not started yet. You reach for your phone before your feet touch the floor. That's the first thing worth noticing. Before anything else, the hand moving toward the phone faster than the mind moving toward a reason. There is nothing dramatic about this moment. That is exactly why it matters. You are not in crisis. You are not at rock bottom. You are simply, quietly, choosing the smaller version of your day again, the way you did yesterday, the way you will tomorrow unless something interrupts the pattern. Nobody is watching. Nobody would even notice if they were. And that is precisely the condition under which most lives get decided, not in the visible collapses, but in these unwitnessed minutes where you pick the safer sentence over the true one. You tell yourself you are being practical. You are waiting until things settle, until you have more information, until the timing makes sense. It sounds like wisdom. It has the cadence of wisdom. But sit with it a moment longer, and a different question surfaces. One you have been careful not to ask directly. What exactly are you waiting for permission from? Not a person, not a deadline. Something quieter than that. Something that has been running your mornings for longer than you'd like to admit. Here is a distinction worth making because the two get confused constantly. There is caution, which is choosing not to act because the timing is genuinely wrong. And there is avoidance, which is choosing not to act and calling it caution, so you don't have to look at the fear underneath. Caution has a reason you could say out loud to someone you respect. Avoidance has an excuse you'd only say to yourself, in the dark, half believing it. Most of what you've been calling patience this year has probably been the second thing wearing the first thing's clothes. You didn't arrive here overnight, and that's part of what makes it so hard to see. Nobody wakes up one day having decided to shrink their life. It happens the way sediment happens, one reasonable decision at a time, each one small enough to defend, each one just slightly smaller than the version of you that existed the day before. You said no to the opportunity because the timing felt off. You didn't send the message because you wanted to think it through properly. You stayed one more year because leaving felt reckless when you looked at it closely. Each choice, alone, sounds sensible. Stacked on top of each other for 5 years, 10 years, they sound like something else entirely. There's a version of you that exists right now, fully formed, that already knows what to do next. You felt it before in the shower, on a drive, in the 10 minutes before sleep when your guard is down, and the noise quiets enough for a single clear thought to surface. That version of you isn't waiting for anything. It isn't checking conditions. It already decided. The gap between that person and the one standing in the kitchen with the phone face down on the counter isn't a gap in knowledge. You know what to do. It has never been about knowing. So what is it about then? Picture the artist who hasn't picked up a brush in 8 months, telling himself he's waiting for inspiration, when what he's actually waiting for is a guarantee that the work will be good before he's willing to risk making it. Picture the version of that same paralysis in your own life, the business plan that's been almost ready for a year, the conversation you've rehearsed 100 times in the shower and had 0 times out loud, the application sitting in your drafts folder since spring. In every case, the story is the same story. You are not short on ideas. You are not short on ability. You are short on the willingness to act before you feel ready, because some part of you has quietly decided that feeling ready is a prerequisite instead of a consequence. That's the reversal almost nobody makes on their own, and it's worth sitting with because it will not feel true the first time you read it. Readiness does not come before the action and then permit it. Readiness comes after the action and is built by it. The confidence you're waiting to feel before you send the message, make the call, start the thing, that confidence does not exist yet, because you haven't done the thing that manufactures it. You are waiting at the exact spot where the thing you want can only be created, not delivered. Think about the last time you actually did the hard thing, not the easy version, the real one. The email you were dreading, the boundary you finally set, the audition you almost skipped. Notice that the fear did not go away right before you did it. It went away afterward, sometimes minutes afterward. Once the doing was already behind you and there was nothing left to be afraid of. That ordering is the whole secret hiding in plain sight. You don't feel brave and then act brave. You act, and the feeling arrives late, almost embarrassed at how long it kept you waiting. There's a particular kind of tiredness that comes from this, one that has nothing to do with how much sleep you got. It's the exhaustion of holding a decision in your hands for months without setting it down either way, not choosing yes, not choosing no, just carrying the weight of an unmade choice everywhere you go, into every unrelated conversation, into the quiet moments before sleep. That weight is heavier than most decisions themselves. People who finally choose even the harder option often describe something close to relief, because at least the carrying has stopped. You are going to be asked, over these next 14 chapters, to look at your own kitchen counter mornings without flinching away from them. Not to judge them, there is nothing here that needs your judgment, only your attention. Just to notice them, name them, and eventually understand exactly why they keep happening. Because the pattern has a mechanism, and mechanisms can be seen once you know where to look. There's a further distinction worth making before moving on, because it will keep the next 14 chapters from being mistaken for permission to act recklessly. Waiting is not the enemy here. Impulsiveness dressed up as courage causes its own kind of damage, and nothing in what follows is an argument for abandoning judgment. The enemy is a specific kind of waiting, the kind that never actually ends, that keeps moving its own finish line every time you get close. That was never really evaluating conditions at all, but simply buying time until the fear settled on its own. Genuine preparation has a defined endpoint you could name today if asked. This kind of waiting doesn't. And that absence of an endpoint is usually the clearest evidence available that something other than caution is actually running the show. For now, only this. The phone is still face down on the counter. The coffee is still cooling. And somewhere underneath the excuse you're rehearsing about timing, there is a much older, much quieter question that has nothing to do with timing at all. The question is not when you'll be ready. The question is what you've been so afraid would happen if you acted before you were. Chapter 2. The Room You Learned Not to See. A quiet indictment. Not of you, but of the mind's oldest trick. The difference between not knowing and refusing to know. There's a kind of not knowing that isn't ignorance at all. It's harder to spot than ignorance, because it wears the same face, uses the same words, sounds identical from the outside. You say, "I didn't realize," when what actually happened is that some part of you realized months ago and simply declined to look directly at what it found. This is not a character flaw. It's a mechanism, and it runs quietly, underneath the version of events you tell yourself and everyone else. Think about the friendship that had been draining you for 2 years before you admitted it to anyone, including yourself. You knew, on some level, every single time you hung up the phone, feeling smaller than before you called. You knew it in your body before you knew it in words. But knowing it in your body doesn't count as knowing. Not to the part of your mind that keeps the official record, the part that needs a story it can live with. So the body kept sending the signal, and the mind kept filing it under something else. Tiredness, a busy week, nothing worth examining. That's the first thing worth naming precisely. The difference between a feeling and a fact you're willing to hold. You felt the friendship costing you something long before you called it costly. The gap between those two moments, feeling it and admitting it, is where an enormous amount of your life has quietly gone. Here is the harder question, the one most people never get around to asking themselves honestly. What is the cost of admitting it? Not admitting it to a stranger, not admitting it in the abstract, but admitting it fully to yourself, with no exit available afterward. Once you know something, you owe it a response. That's the real reason the noticing gets delayed. It isn't that you can't see clearly. It's that clarity comes with a bill attached, and some part of you has been avoiding the invoice for longer than you'd like to admit. Picture the version of you standing at a door you've walked past 100 times, always looking the other way as you pass it, never quite stopping. You know roughly what's behind that door. You've caught glimpses, but you've built an entire routine around never turning your head fully toward it, because turning your head fully means you can't unsee it. And once you can't unsee it, you have to do something about it. So the door stays there, unopened, and you get remarkably good at walking a hallway you've rearranged your whole life to avoid. This is what functional denial actually is. Not blindness, a kind of disciplined looking away, maintained daily at real cost to protect you from a truth your system has judged too expensive to hold. And here's the part that reframes everything. The system isn't malfunctioning when it does this. It's working exactly as designed. Denial isn't a failure of the mind. It's a form of triage, deployed by something in you that decided, at some point, that you weren't ready to carry what the truth would ask of you. Which raises the real question, the one underneath all of it. Not why can't you see it? You can see it. The evidence has been visible for a long time, sitting right there in plain view every time you walked past that door. The real question is what you believe would happen to you if you let yourself see it fully, without the usual escape hatch of not quite noticing. What is the catastrophe your mind is protecting you from? The one it's decided is worse than years of low-grade exhaustion. For most people, when they finally sit long enough with that question to get an honest answer, it isn't the truth itself they were avoiding. It's what the truth would require of them. If you admit the job has been wrong for 3 years, you owe yourself a decision about the job. If you admit the relationship stopped being what it was, you owe yourself a conversation you've been rehearsing and canceling in your head for months. Denial isn't really about the seeing. It's a strategy for postponing the doing, dressed up convincingly enough that it can pass as simply not having noticed yet. There's a particular kind of relief that shows up the moment someone finally says the thing out loud the thing they'd been circling for months without landing on. Watch it happen to someone close to you and you'll see it. Their shoulders drop half an inch. Their voice changes register, gets steadier, almost lighter, even though what they just admitted is, on paper, worse news than the vague unease they'd been carrying. That's not a coincidence. Carrying an unnamed thing takes more energy than carrying a named one, even a heavy named one, because the unnamed version requires constant maintenance. You have to keep not looking. That takes work. Looking, once you finally do it, takes one hard moment and then nothing further. Somewhere in your life right now there is a door like the one described earlier. You already know roughly which one. You knew before you finished reading this sentence, which is itself the proof of everything just described. The knowledge was never missing, only the willingness to hold it in the open, where it would ask something of you. There's a distinction worth adding here, because it's easy to confuse two things that look similar from a distance. There is denial, the thing this chapter has been describing, where you decline to fully register a truth because registering it would demand a response you're not ready to give. And there is discretion, which is different, seeing a truth completely, clearly, without any flinching, and then choosing deliberately when and how to act on it. Discretion is mature. It respects timing without distorting the underlying fact. Denial distorts the fact itself, quietly, so that timing never even becomes a real question, because the truth was never fully admitted in the first place. Picture two people leaving the same difficult job. One spent the final year fully aware the role had stopped fitting, choosing with open eyes to stay a few more months to finish a project and secure a reference. The other spent that same year in a fog of half-noticing, telling themselves the frustration was temporary, the team would improve, next quarter would be different, right up until the moment they were let go and the frustration they'd been managing for a year finally had permission to surface all at once. Both people left. Only one of them chose the timing. The other had the timing chosen for them by circumstances, because they'd spent the year not fully looking at what they already, somewhere, knew. That's the real cost of functional denial, distinct from the cost described earlier. It doesn't just delay the reckoning. It hands the timing of that reckoning to something other than you, to circumstance, to someone else's patience running out first, to a crisis that finally makes the door impossible to keep walking past. Discretion keeps the choice in your hands. Denial eventually gives it away. Nobody can open that door for you, and nothing here is going to pretend otherwise. But it helps at least to stop calling it not knowing. Call it what it is. You have been managing a truth, not missing one. And a truth that's being managed instead of faced doesn't disappear just because you've gotten skilled at walking past it. It waits. Quietly, patiently, exactly where you left it. For the day you finally decide the hallway isn't worth rearranging anymore. Chapter 3. The Two Selves. You've always known about. Revelation of the mechanism. Deep understanding but not resolution yet that comes later. There is a version of you that shows up when everything is already going well. You know this version. It's the one that speaks up in the meeting without rehearsing the sentence first, that sends the message without reading it 4 times, that says yes to the thing before the fear has a chance to build its case. You've met this version of yourself at weddings, on good vacations, in the middle of a project that's finally clicking. It feels less like a mood, and more like a different operating system entirely, one where hesitation simply isn't part of the architecture. And there is another version, the one that shows up on ordinary Tuesdays, in kitchens, at 6:47 in the morning with a phone face down on the counter. This version checks the conditions before it moves. It waits for certainty that never fully arrives. It has 100 reasonable-sounding explanations for why now isn't quite the right time, and every one of them sounds sensible in isolation. Here is what almost nobody says plainly enough, early enough, for it to actually land. These are not two moods. They are two identities, running on the same body, taking turns at the wheel, and you have spent most of your adult life assuming the second one is simply who you are, while the first one is a lucky exception that happens when conditions align. That assumption is backwards, and once you see it clearly, you cannot fully unsee it. Call the first one your built self. Not because it's fake, it's the opposite of fake. It's the version of you least performed, least filtered through fear. Call it built because it was assembled deliberately, over years, out of 1,000 small decisions to act despite doubt, instead of waiting for doubt to leave first. Every skill you're proud of, every relationship that actually holds weight, every piece of work you defend without apology, all of it came from that self, operating. Now call the second one your borrowed self. It runs on borrowed permission from circumstances, from other people's approval, from a feeling of readiness it keeps waiting to receive from somewhere outside itself. It never quite owns its own authority. It checks first. It's not that this self is weak, it's that it has outsourced its own ignition switch to conditions it doesn't control, which means it spends most of its life stalled, waiting for someone or something else to turn the key. The mistake, the one worth sitting with because it explains almost everything, is thinking the built self is rare, and the borrowed self is default. It's the reverse. The borrowed self is not more natural to you. It's simply louder, because fear is loud, and the built self has to be practiced into volume the way any instrument does. Nobody is born fluent in acting from decided identity, instead of waiting for permission. It's built, one uncomfortable rep at a time, the exact way any other kind of strength gets built. You've felt the switch happen before, probably more than once, and it's worth remembering an actual instance rather than the idea of it. A moment where you were dreading something for days, running every possible bad outcome, and then the moment finally arrived and something in you simply changed gears. You walked into the room. You said the thing. Afterward, you couldn't entirely explain where the fear had gone, only that somewhere between deciding and doing it had stopped being the loudest voice in the room. That shift, that exact shift, is the built self taking the wheel from the borrowed one. It's available to you far more often than the mornings would suggest. Here's the distinction that changes how the whole rest of this journey will land, so it's worth being precise about it. Confidence and identity are not the same thing, though they get treated as synonyms constantly. Confidence is a feeling, and feelings are unreliable, weather-dependent, gone by Tuesday for no reason you can name. Identity is a decision, made once and then simply acted from, regardless of the weather. You do not need to feel confident to act from your built self. You need only to have decided, in advance, which self gets to drive today. Waiting for the feeling of confidence to arrive before acting is exactly the trap the borrowed self depends on to stay in charge, because that feeling, on its own terms, was never going to arrive first. There's an old idea, worn thin by overuse, that people simply need more self-belief. It's not quite wrong, but it points at the wrong target. Self-belief isn't a resource you accumulate until you have enough. It's a byproduct, generated by the built self every time it acts, and depleted every time the borrowed self is allowed to run the show instead. You don't build confidence and then act. You act from the identity you've decided on, and confidence trails a few steps behind, arriving late the way it always does, surprised to find you already halfway through the thing it was supposed to be required for. So here is the pattern, named plainly, the way it deserved to be named a long time ago. You have not been failing to try hard enough. You have not been lacking discipline, or willpower, or the right morning routine. You have been letting the wrong self answer the phone. Every morning is, quietly, an election between the version of you that acts from decision and the version that waits for permission. And for a long time now, without quite noticing the vote was happening, you've been letting the second one win by default. It helps to see this play out in a domain far from the kitchen counter, because the pattern doesn't confine itself to any one area of life. Watch how differently the two selves handle money, for instance. The borrowed self checks the account balance with a flinch, avoids opening certain emails, makes decisions from a kind of financial fog, hoping vague avoidance will somehow prevent bad news rather than simply delaying it. The built self, even with far less money in the account, looks directly at the number, makes a plan proportionate to what's actually there, and acts from that plan rather than from the anxiety surrounding it. Nothing about their objective circumstances necessarily differs. What differs is which self is doing the looking, and a self that looks directly tends to make better decisions than one that's mostly trying not to see. This will not resolve itself simply because you can now name it. Naming a mechanism is not the same as dismantling one, and it would be dishonest to pretend otherwise at this stage. What naming gives you is something more modest and more useful, the ability to catch the moment it's happening in real time, instead of only recognizing it in hindsight, hours later, once the borrowed self has already made the call. You will feel both selves again today, possibly within the hour, and for the first time, you will know exactly what you're looking at when you do. That knowing changes nothing by itself. It is, however, the only place any real change has ever started from. Chapter 4. How the switch actually works. The mechanism opened up. Not judged, just examined the way you'd examine an engine to understand why it stalls. Every time the borrowed self takes the wheel instead of the built one, it follows the same three-step sequence, and once you can see the sequence, you can see it happening in real time instead of only afterward, when it's already too late to intervene. Step 1 is always a signal. Something arrives, an opportunity, a request, a moment that requires you to move. It might be an email that needs a reply, a conversation you've been putting off, a decision with a deadline attached. This part is neutral. It's simply the world asking something of you, the way it asks something of everyone, constantly, all day. Step 2 is where the mechanism actually lives, and it happens fast enough that most people never catch it happening. Somewhere between 100 and 300 milliseconds after the signal arrives, before a single conscious thought has formed, your nervous system runs a threat assessment. Is this safe? Is this going to cost me something I'm not prepared to lose? The assessment isn't rational, and it isn't checking against your actual present-day life. It's checking against an old internal database, built years ago, sometimes decades ago. Out of every previous moment where saying yes to something like this cost you more than you expected. This is the part worth sitting with, because it reframes what's actually happening in that kitchen, on that ordinary Tuesday. You are not weighing today's opportunity against today's risk. You're weighing it against a risk profile assembled long before this particular opportunity existed, built from experiences that may have nothing to do with the email sitting in front of you right now. The system is fast, and it is thorough, and it is very often working from outdated information. Step 3 is the part everyone notices, because it's the only part that reaches conscious awareness. The hesitation, the reasonable-sounding delay. Let me think about it. I'll get back to you. Now isn't quite the right time. These sentences feel like careful deliberation. Mostly they are the visible surface of Step 2 already having happened, already having flagged the signal as unsafe, already having handed control to the borrowed self before you were even aware a decision point had occurred. By the time you consciously notice yourself hesitating, the vote has already been cast. You're not deciding in that moment. You're narrating a decision that already happened below the threshold of noticing. Here's what makes this genuinely hard to interrupt, and it deserves to be said without the usual softening. You cannot outthink a mechanism that operates faster than thought. Willpower doesn't work here, because willpower is a conscious mind tool, and by the time your conscious mind gets involved, the threat assessment has already run, and the borrowed self already has its hand on the wheel. This is why telling yourself to just be braver has never worked for more than a day or two. You're bringing a conscious-level tool to a subconscious-level problem. And the mismatch is the entire reason years of good intentions haven't produced lasting change. So if willpower doesn't reach the mechanism, what does? The answer is quieter than most people expect, and less dramatic than the mechanism itself. You cannot outrun the threat assessment, but you can retrain what it's assessing against. Every single time you act from the built self instead of the borrowed one, even in something small, even in something nobody else witnesses, you add a new entry to that old internal database. A new data point that says, this kind of situation actually turned out fine. Do it enough times in small enough increments, and the threat assessment itself starts to shift. Not because you argued with it, but because you gave it new evidence to work from. This is worth distinguishing clearly from something that sounds similar but isn't. Exposure isn't the same as force. Forcing yourself into the largest, scariest version of the action, hoping the intensity will overwhelm the mechanism in one dramatic attempt, usually backfires. It floods the threat assessment with exactly the kind of overwhelming signal that confirms danger, reinforcing the old pattern instead of updating it. The mechanism doesn't get retrained by one heroic leap. It gets retrained by dozens of small, survivable moments where the built self acted and nothing catastrophic followed. Small and repeated beats large and rare, every time. When the target is a nervous system pattern instead of a single decision. There's a version of this that plays out in 100 ordinary settings, and it's worth picturing one concretely. Someone terrified of public speaking doesn't get cured by one triumphant keynote. They get changed by the 5th, the 20th, the 40th small moment of speaking up in a meeting where the room didn't collapse, where nothing bad happened, where the old prediction quietly failed to come true one more time. The fear doesn't vanish in a single afternoon. It erodes, data point by data point, the way any pattern built over years erodes slowly, and then, somewhat suddenly, not at all. You can start today, and it will not look impressive. It might look like sending the message you've drafted 4 times, exactly as it is, without the extra paragraph of softening you keep adding. It might look like saying the honest thing in a conversation instead of the easier thing. None of it will feel like the dramatic turning point you might be picturing. That's fine. The database doesn't care about drama. It only cares about repetition. What matters is that you now know what's actually happening in that gap between the signal and the hesitation. It isn't weakness. It isn't a character flaw showing up at the worst possible moments. It's a fast, outdated, deeply literal threat detection system doing exactly the job it was built to do, using information that, in most cases, stopped being accurate years ago. It helps to picture the threat assessment as something closer to an oversensitive smoke detector than a broken one. A smoke detector calibrated years ago in a small apartment with a particularly smoky stove will shriek at the slightest hint of steam long after you've moved into a kitchen with proper ventilation. The alarm isn't malfunctioning in any technical sense. It's doing exactly what it was calibrated to do. It's simply calibrated for a kitchen that no longer exists. Nobody looks at a smoke detector going off over a pot of boiling water and concludes the detector is fundamentally broken. They recalibrate it or replace it, because the underlying hardware is fine, and only the sensitivity setting is wrong for the current environment. Your threat assessment deserves the same diagnosis, not the harsher one you've probably been giving it for years. It isn't broken. It's calibrated for an earlier kitchen, an earlier set of stakes, an earlier version of what counted as dangerous. Every small action taken despite its alarm is, in effect, a recalibration event, a moment where the detector screams and nothing burns, and the sensitivity setting quietly adjusts a fraction downward, because the evidence no longer supports the old threshold. Do this often enough, in small enough increments, and the alarm eventually starts matching the kitchen you're actually standing in now, instead of the one that shaped it originally. The mechanism isn't your enemy. It's just old. And old systems, unlike character, can be updated. Chapter 5. What it's actually costing you. The honest weight, not the cost you can name easily, the one that's been accumulating quietly, in currencies you weren't tracking. Ask yourself what waiting has cost you, and the first answer that arrives will almost certainly be wrong. Not dishonest, just too small. You'll think of the obvious thing, the job you didn't apply for, the trip you didn't take, and you'll feel a familiar twinge of regret. Manageable, survivable, the kind you've gotten used to living alongside. That's not the real number. That's the number your mind offers up because the actual figure is too large to hold comfortably. And some part of you would rather round down than face it in full. The real cost was never the single decision. It was every decision, that decision quietly authorized afterward. The year you didn't apply for the role you wanted set a precedent, one you didn't consciously ratify but absorbed anyway, that this is simply what you do when the stakes feel real. The next hard choice arrived a little easier to avoid because the first one had already proven, to some part of you keeping score, that avoiding works, that the world doesn't end when you choose the smaller path. Cost doesn't accumulate in a straight line. It compounds, the way debt compounds, quietly, in the background, while you're busy managing the visible parts of your life. Here's a distinction that matters more than it first appears to. There's the cost of the thing you didn't do, and there's the cost of becoming someone who doesn't do things. The first is finite, a missed opportunity, painful but bounded, over and done with by a certain date. The second is not finite at all. It's an identity, forming quietly with each avoided decision, until one day you look up and realize you've become a person who waits, not by declaration, but by 10,000 small confirmations nobody ever asked you to sign. Consider the version of you that exists 5 years from now if nothing here changes. Not a stranger, the same face, the same voice, carrying the same reasonable-sounding explanations, just older, and further from the version that still believed the timing would eventually feel right. That person isn't a warning designed to frighten you into action. It's simply what compounding looks like when you extend it forward instead of only looking backward. Most people can describe their past avoidances in specific, painful detail. Almost nobody sits long enough with the projection forward, because the past at least has the mercy of being finished. There's a cost, too, that doesn't show up on any list of missed events, and it might be the heaviest one carried. It's the erosion of your own credibility with yourself. Every time you tell yourself you'll do something and then don't, a small deposit gets made in an account you're not consciously tracking, evidence that your word, even to yourself, especially to yourself, isn't fully reliable. Do this enough times and something subtle shifts. You stop believing your own plans while you're still making them, because some part of you already suspects, correctly, based on the evidence, that this one probably won't happen either. That quiet self-distrust is more corrosive than any single missed opportunity, because it undermines the very mechanism you'd need to change anything at all. It's worth being precise here, because vague guilt helps nobody, and this isn't an invitation to punish yourself for a pattern that took years to form and won't dissolve from shame alone. The point isn't that you've failed. The point is that the ledger has been running this whole time, whether or not you were checking it, and most of what's owed isn't listed under regret. It's listed under identity, under who you've quietly become, while telling yourself you were only being careful. Picture someone who spent a decade telling themselves they'd start the business once things were more stable. The visible cost is obvious. The business never started. But sit with them long enough, and you'll find a second cost, less obvious and more permanent. They've become someone who describes their own dreams in the past conditional. Not, "I'm going to," but "I always thought I might have." That grammatical shift, from future tense to past conditional, is the real toll. It's not that the door closed, it's that they stopped speaking as though it were still open. Here's what makes this chapter necessary rather than simply grim. Naming the actual cost, in full, without softening it, is the only thing that makes the next decision feel proportionate to what's at stake. As long as the cost stays vague, a background hum of mild dissatisfaction, it will always lose to the sharper, more immediate discomfort of taking action today. Discomfort now versus vague cost later is not a fair fight, and vague cost later always loses every time to a mind built to weight the present more heavily than the future. The only way to change the outcome of that comparison is to stop letting the future cost stay vague. There's one more distinction worth making before the full weight of this settles, because it changes how the cost actually feels once it's named. There is the cost of an opportunity that closes permanently, gone the moment the window shuts, no longer available under any circumstances. And there is a second, more common kind of cost, one that doesn't close the door so much as raise the price of walking through it. The role you didn't apply for 5 years ago may genuinely be gone, but the capacity to apply for the next one, to walk into a room and advocate for yourself without years of unpracticed hesitation weighing down every sentence, that capacity doesn't disappear in a single missed event. It erodes, gradually, the less it gets used, the same way any unused capacity erodes, until the next opportunity requires far more effort to reach for than it would have 5 years earlier, not because the opportunity itself got harder, but because you did, in the specific sense of losing practice at reaching. This is worth naming because it explains why the cost compounds even in areas where no single door ever actually closed. Every year of avoidance doesn't only cost you that year's specific chance, it raises the effort required for the next chance, and the one after that, because the muscle involved in reaching for things atrophies exactly the way any other muscle does when it goes unused. The good news sits quietly inside that same mechanism. Muscles that atrophy from disuse can also be rebuilt, and rebuilding never requires reversing every year of disuse at once. It only requires reaching again today, in something small enough to be the first rep. So look at it plainly, one more time, without flinching and without spiraling. Not the missed events. The identity those missed events have been quietly building, brick by brick, out of your own repeated confirmations. That identity has a name, even if you've never said it out loud. The version of you who waits. It has been getting built for years, with your unwitting cooperation, and it will keep getting built by default for as many more years as the pattern continues uninterrupted. This isn't the chapter where anything gets fixed. It couldn't be, you can't repair what you haven't fully priced. But now the number is on the table, the real one, not the rounded-down version you've been living with. And once a cost is seen clearly, in full, it stops being background noise. It becomes something you can no longer pretend not to notice paying. Chapter 6. Why Nothing Has Stuck Before. Understood failure without blame. Not, you didn't try hard enough. A different, more accurate explanation. You have tried before. This is worth saying plainly, because somewhere along the way you may have started telling yourself a different story, one where you simply never made the effort, where the pattern persisted because you didn't want change badly enough. That story is false, and it's worth discarding before going any further, because it will quietly sabotage everything that comes after it if left unexamined. You have started the morning routine. You have made the list. You have had the conversation with yourself more than once about who you're going to be starting Monday. The evidence of effort is not missing. What's missing is an explanation for why the effort didn't hold. Here's the explanation, and it has nothing to do with weakness. Most attempts at change target the wrong layer entirely. They aim at behavior: wake up earlier, send the email, have the conversation while leaving the threat assessment described a few chapters back completely untouched. You can install a new behavior on top of an unchanged nervous system for exactly as long as willpower holds out, which for almost everyone is somewhere between 11 and 21 days. Then the old system, never actually retrained, reasserts itself, and the behavior collapses back to baseline. This isn't a personal failure. It's what happens, predictably, every time. when the intervention doesn't reach the layer where the actual resistance lives. Consider the version of this you've probably lived through yourself. A new year, a new routine, real commitment behind it, genuine belief that this time would be different. For a while it was. And then, without a single dramatic moment of quitting, the mornings started slipping. One missed day became two, became a week, became a return to exactly where things started, except now with an added layer of quiet disappointment stacked on top. That disappointment is important to notice because it's usually misdiagnosed. It gets filed under "I lack discipline," when the more accurate filing would be "I targeted the wrong mechanism, using a tool that was never going to reach it." There's a second reason attempts collapse, subtler than the first, and it deserves its own attention. Most people try to change everything at once, on the theory that a big enough leap will overwhelm the old pattern before it can reassert itself. This feels intuitive. It is, almost without exception, exactly backward. A large leap generates a large threat signal, and a large threat signal triggers exactly the defensive response the leap was meant to escape. The nervous system doesn't reward ambition. It rewards precedent, and precedent is built in small survivable increments, not single heroic gestures. Think of someone who decides in one determined weekend to overhaul their entire life: new diet, new schedule, new social habits, all beginning Monday morning. The intention is sincere, but the scale of the change floods the system with more novelty and threat than it can metabolize, and within 2 weeks, most or all of it has quietly reverted. Compare that to someone who changes one small specific behavior and holds it for a month before adding a second. The second person looks less ambitious on paper. They also tend to still be standing a year later, while the first person's Monday reinvention has usually been forgotten by March. There's a third failure pattern, and it might be the most common of the three, precisely because it looks like the opposite of failure while it's happening. Call it premature complexity. This is the person who, before taking a single real step, builds an elaborate system for the change, the perfect app, the detailed spreadsheet, the comprehensive plan covering every contingency. All of this feels like progress. It generates the sensation of movement, the satisfaction of preparation, without ever requiring the one thing that was actually at stake, doing the uncomfortable thing itself. The system becomes a sophisticated form of the exact avoidance being described back in Chapter 1, dressed up convincingly enough to pass as productivity. Here's the distinction worth holding on to through the rest of this journey, because it will keep mattering. There's a difference between preparing and postponing, and the two can look identical from the outside while meaning something completely different. Preparing is gathering what's genuinely required before a necessary step. Postponing is gathering more than is required indefinitely, because gathering feels safer than stepping. The test is simple, even if applying it honestly takes some nerve. Ask whether what you're doing right now is something the actual first step requires, or whether it's something that lets you feel like you're moving, while the actual first step keeps getting pushed 1 week further out. None of this means the previous attempts were wasted. Every failed attempt at change generates information, even when it doesn't generate the change itself. And that information matters more than it seemed to at the time. You now know that behavior-only interventions don't hold. You know that large leaps trigger defensive collapse. You know that elaborate preparation can quietly function as its own form of avoidance. Nobody handed you that knowledge in advance. You earned it, through every attempt that didn't stick, in exactly the way that knowledge usually gets earned. What changes now isn't willpower, and it isn't motivation, both of which you've already proven, through years of genuine effort, that you have inadequate supply. What changes is the target. Instead of aiming at the visible behavior, the aim moves one layer deeper, toward the mechanism itself. Retrained the way any pattern actually gets retrained, in small, repeatable, survivable increments that accumulate evidence rather than demand a single act of heroism. There's a fourth reason worth naming, quieter than the other three, And it hides particularly well because it wears the costume of self-awareness. Call it diagnostic substitution, the habit of using the language of psychological insight as a stand-in for the action that insight was supposed to lead to. You read about the mechanism. You recognize yourself in it. You can explain your own pattern with real fluency to a friend over coffee. And something about that fluency feels like progress. It can be, when it leads somewhere. Often, though, the explaining becomes the whole activity, satisfying enough on its own that the actual small action it was meant to precede keeps getting quietly postponed in favor of one more round of understanding the problem more thoroughly. This is worth naming honestly because this exact journey, the one you're in the middle of right now, carries the same risk. Insight is not dangerous by itself, but insight mistaken for change is one of the more comfortable ways of never actually changing, precisely because it feels like effort while asking nothing uncomfortable of you. The chapters so far have handed you a genuinely accurate map of the mechanism. A map, however accurate, has never once moved anyone down a road. Only walking does that, and walking was never going to feel as intellectually satisfying as studying the map did, which is exactly why so many people, understanding their pattern perfectly, still wake up next year in the same kitchen, older, more articulate about the problem, and no further along in solving it. You were not failing before. You were solving the right problem with the wrong tool, which only looks like failure from the outside. That distinction changes everything about what comes next. Chapter 7. The one thing that actually works. First real movement. The energy of someone seeing a way out for the first time, small, concrete, and finally aimed at the right target. There is a version of the phone face down on the counter morning that ends differently, and it starts with something almost embarrassingly small. Not a plan, not a system, a single specific action, chosen in advance, so precisely defined that there's no ambiguity left for the borrowed self to exploit in the gap between deciding and doing. Here is what that looks like in practice, because vague encouragement has never been the thing missing from your life. You pick one signal, one recurring moment, where the pattern from Chapter 4 reliably shows up. Maybe it's the message you draft and don't send. Maybe it's the idea you mention and then quietly downgrade before anyone can respond to it. Whatever it is, you already know which one, the same way you already knew which door in Chapter 2. And you decide, in advance, at a calm moment, not in the heat of the hesitation itself, exactly what the built self does when that signal appears next. This timing detail matters more than it sounds like it should. Deciding what to do in the moment of hesitation is nearly impossible, because that's precisely the moment when the threat assessment has already run, and the borrowed self already has its hand on the wheel. Deciding in advance, when the nervous system isn't activated, is a different operation entirely. You're not fighting the mechanism in real time. You're preloading the built self's response, so there's nothing left to decide when the signal arrives. The decision gets made once, calmly, and then simply executed, over and over, exactly like a rehearsed line rather than an improvised one. Notice what this action should not be, because the instinct to make it bigger will show up almost immediately, disguised as ambition. It should not be the biggest, scariest version of the pattern you're interrupting. It should be small enough that failure feels almost impossible, small enough that the nervous system barely registers it as a threat worth escalating over. Chapter 6 already explained why the large leap fails. This is where that explanation becomes practical. If the message you've been avoiding is the difficult conversation with a business partner, the first move isn't that conversation. It's something smaller inside the same category, sending the low-stakes email you've also been sitting on, the one with nothing close to the same weight, chosen specifically because success there is nearly guaranteed. This can feel almost insultingly modest at first, and that reaction is worth naming honestly rather than pushing past it. Some part of you wants the first move to be proportionate to how long you've been stuck, as if a decade of avoidance deserves a correspondingly dramatic reversal. That instinct is exactly backward, and it's worth remembering it's the same instinct that sank the New Year's overhaul back in the last chapter. The nervous system doesn't care how long the pattern has run. It only cares whether this specific action, right now, feels survivable. Small and survivable, repeated, beats large and symbolic, attempted once and abandoned. Consider what happens the first time you actually do it. The small version, chosen in advance, executed without waiting for the feeling of readiness to arrive first. Something specific happens in the minutes afterward, worth paying close attention to, because it's easy to miss if you're not looking for it. Nothing catastrophic occurs. The message sends, and the day continues, largely unchanged on the surface. But underneath the surface, something has shifted that wasn't there an hour before. The internal database from Chapter 4 has received a new entry. This kind of thing actually turned out fine. It's a small deposit, almost too small to notice on its own. It's also the only kind of deposit that has ever actually retrained the mechanism. Here's the part that tends to surprise people the first time they experience it, because it runs against everything the earlier chapters might have led you to expect. The fear doesn't need to be resolved before the action. It only needs to be smaller than the action requires. You do not have to defeat the borrowed self in some decisive confrontation before the built self gets to act. You only have to choose something modest enough that the built self can act despite the borrowed self still muttering in the background, unconvinced, unconsulted, and, for once, overruled anyway. This is worth distinguishing from a related idea that sounds similar but isn't. This isn't about pretending the fear doesn't exist, and it isn't about suppressing it through sheer force of will. Suppression is exhausting and temporary, the same way the New Year's overhaul was exhausting and temporary. What's being described here is different, letting the fear stay present, unresolved, unconvinced, while acting anyway, in something small enough that acting despite it doesn't require heroics. The fear doesn't have to leave the room. It just doesn't get to drive. There's a specific kind of energy that shows up after the first successful small move. And it's worth naming so you recognize it when it arrives, rather than dismissing it as coincidence. It isn't euphoria. It's quieter than that, closer to surprise. The particular surprise of discovering that a door you'd assumed was locked opens when you actually try the handle. That surprise is data, and data compounds. The second small move gets slightly easier than the first, not because willpower increased, but because the internal database now has 2 entries instead of 1. And 2 entries carry more weight against years of contrary evidence than either one alone. None of this requires you to become a different person overnight, and nothing here is asking you to. It requires one signal, identified honestly. One response, decided in advance, calmly before the moment arrives. One small action, modest enough to survive contact with the fear that's already going to be present regardless. That's the entire mechanism of the first real movement. And it is, on purpose, almost anticlimactic. Consider how this plays out for someone who has spent 2 years not submitting a finished manuscript to a single agent, waiting for a revision that would finally make it undeniable. The small chosen action isn't submitting to the dream agent, the one whose rejection would confirm every fear the manuscript's writer has been quietly protecting themselves from testing. It's submitting to one credible agent, chosen specifically because a rejection there, while not pleasant, wouldn't be catastrophic. And an acceptance there would be real without being so high stakes that the fear refuses to let the action happen at all. 2 years of paralysis dissolves, in practice, into a single afternoon of research, and 1 email sent to a name low enough on the list that sending it barely registers as brave. That's not a smaller victory than the dramatic version would have been. It's the only version that was ever actually going to happen. Tomorrow morning, the phone will still be on the counter. The coffee will still be there, going cold the way it always does. But this time, there's a decision already made, waiting quietly for the signal to appear. needing nothing further from you except to let the plan you already made be the one that runs. That's not confidence. It's simply the first entry in a ledger you've decided, finally, to start filling in your own favor. Chapter 8. What rises when you actually try? The internal conflict, named with clarity and without romanticizing it. What resistance feels like from the inside, the moment change becomes real. The first small move worked. You sent the message, had the conversation, made the call, something modest, something survivable, exactly as described in the last chapter. And then a few days later, something unexpected happened. Not failure, something quieter and more confusing than failure. A pull backward, showing up right when things had started to go well, dressed in language that sounded almost reasonable. This deserves to be named precisely, because it catches most people off guard the first time it arrives, and being caught off guard is exactly what makes it dangerous. Resistance rarely shows up when things are going badly. It shows up when things start going right, at the exact moment the old identity feels most threatened by the new evidence contradicting it. This isn't a sign that something's wrong with the process. It's a sign the process is working, close enough to real change that something in you has started defending the old arrangement. Here's the mechanism worth understanding, stated plainly rather than mystically. The borrowed self from Chapter 3 didn't simply lose the moment you sent that first message. It's still there, still running its threat assessments, and it has now registered a new and specific danger. You might actually become someone who acts consistently, which would mean the borrowed self loses its job entirely. That's not a small threat from its perspective. It's existential, and systems facing existential threats don't go quietly. They escalate. The escalation rarely looks like outright refusal, because outright refusal would be too obvious, too easy to catch and override. It looks like reasonable-sounding hesitation, wearing the same clothes wisdom wears. A wave of tiredness arrives exactly when the next small step needs taking. A perfectly logical reason surfaces for why this week isn't quite the week to continue the momentum. An old doubt, one you thought you'd already worked through, resurfaces with fresh, specific-sounding evidence attached, as though it had been waiting patiently for an opening. Notice, too, the particular flavor this resistance takes when it aims at the relationships around you rather than at the action itself. A friend expresses mild concern about the new direction, phrased as care. A family member asks a pointed question that sounds practical but lands like doubt. None of this is necessarily malicious, and it's worth resisting the urge to cast anyone as a villain here. People closest to the old version of you built their own expectations around that version, and your changing disrupts something in their world too, not just yours. But their discomfort, however well-intentioned, can become raw material the borrowed self uses to argue its case. See, even they're not sure this is a good idea. Here's a distinction worth making carefully, because getting it wrong in either direction causes real damage. There's a difference between resistance and a genuine signal that something needs adjusting. Not every doubt that arrives mid-change is the borrowed self defending its territory. Sometimes the pace really is too fast. Sometimes a legitimate practical concern really does deserve attention. The test isn't whether doubt exists in almost every real change, on both sides of that difference. The test is where the doubt is aimed. Resistance tends to attack the decision itself, retroactively, as though it were never sound to begin with. A genuine signal tends to attack the execution, the pace, the method, the specifics, while leaving the underlying decision intact. Learning to tell these apart takes practice, and getting it wrong occasionally is part of that practice, not a disqualifying failure. There's a particular moment worth preparing for in advance, because it arrives for nearly everyone attempting real change, and arriving unprepared for it is what causes most people to fold. It's the moment the resistance produces its most convincing argument yet, the one that almost sounds like insight rather than fear. Maybe this isn't actually who you are. Maybe the old version was more honest, more realistic, and this new effort is a kind of performance that's bound to collapse eventually anyway. So why not save the trouble and stop now before the collapse becomes public? This argument feels different from the earlier, more obviously flimsy ones. It feels like clarity. It is, in fact, the resistance's most sophisticated move, precisely because it borrows the language of self-honesty to argue for the identity it's actually trying to protect. The way through this moment isn't to defeat the argument point by point, the way you might in a real debate. Debating it grants it a legitimacy it doesn't deserve, and it can generate a counter-argument for nearly anything you say, indefinitely, because that's what it's optimized to do. The way through is simpler and less satisfying in the moment, though far more effective over time. You notice the argument, name it for what it is, resistance escalating because the old pattern feels genuinely threatened, and you continue the small, modest action from the last chapter anyway, without waiting for the internal debate to resolve first. The debate doesn't need to be won. It only needs to be recognized as noise, allowed to run in the background, unconsulted, while the action proceeds regardless. This is worth linking back to something said earlier, because it applies here with even more force than it did the first time. The built self was never required to feel fully confident before acting. It's not required to fully silence the resistance before continuing either. The resistance can keep talking. It usually will, for longer than feels comfortable. What matters is whether it gets a vote. And for the first time in longer than you might realize, you get to decide that it doesn't. Picture someone 3 weeks into a genuine change, further along than they've been in years, who wakes up one morning gripped by a wave of doubt so specific and articulate, it feels less like fear and more like sudden clarity. Maybe this was always a mistake. Maybe the old life, whatever its problems, was at least honest about what it was. They do not resolve this doubt through argument. They simply notice its timing 3 weeks in, right after real progress, exactly when the pattern described in this chapter would predict it, and they do the small scheduled action anyway. Doubt fully present, unconvinced, unresolved. The doubt doesn't vanish afterward. It quiets, the way it usually does, not because it lost the argument, but because it was never given the floor to make one in the first place. This is worth remembering the next time a similarly persuasive wave arrives, because it will arrive again, likely more than once, often precisely when things are going best. Its timing is not a coincidence, and its persuasiveness is not evidence of its accuracy. Both are simply features of a system defending territory it's losing, and systems defending lost territory tend to escalate their rhetoric exactly when the stakes for them are highest. There's something almost reassuring, once you've seen this pattern clearly, in recognizing how predictable it actually is. This isn't a sign your change is failing. It's closer to a sign it's working, showing up on schedule, right where the mechanism described in earlier chapters would predict it should. The resistance rising isn't evidence you were wrong about any of this. It's evidence you were finally right enough to be worth fighting. Chapter 9. When Nothing in You Wants to. Applying the pattern under low energy. When nothing favors you and the old pattern tries to come back. There will be a day, probably sooner than you'd like, when none of what you've built so far feels available to you. Not because the mechanism stopped working, and not because the earlier chapters were wrong about anything. Because you're tired in a way that has nothing to do with willpower, running on a night of bad sleep, a hard week, a body that simply doesn't have the reserves it had when the plan was made. This is the day worth preparing for specifically, because it's the day most change quietly dies, not from opposition, but from depletion. Here's what makes this day different from the resistance described in the last chapter, and the distinction matters because the two require different responses. Resistance is the old identity actively arguing against the new one, producing reasons, producing doubt, putting up a fight. Depletion isn't arguing anything. It's simply a diminished capacity, a nervous system with less in the tank than the plan assumed it would have, and it doesn't announce itself as an enemy. It just makes everything, including the small, modest actions from Chapter 7, feel disproportionately heavy, as though the ground itself had gotten steeper overnight without anyone changing the incline. Most plans for change fail to account for this at all, and that's worth naming as the actual design flaw it is, rather than a personal shortcoming discovered too late. A plan built entirely around your best mornings, well-rested, clear-headed, motivated, is a plan that only ever gets tested under ideal conditions. Ideal conditions are rare. Most days sit somewhere in the middle, and some days sit well below it. A pattern that only survives your best mornings was never going to survive contact with an actual ordinary life, which is made up mostly of mornings that aren't your best. This is where a distinction from earlier becomes essential again, though it applies slightly differently here than it did in the resistance chapter. Discipline is the will to act regardless of how you feel, drawn from a reserve that depletes with use. Fidelity is different, a commitment that doesn't ask how you feel before it proceeds, because it was never conditional on feeling in the first place. Discipline runs out on the exhausted days precisely because it depends on a resource that exhaustion depletes directly. Fidelity doesn't run on that resource at all. It runs on a decision made once, in advance, that doesn't get relitigated every morning based on the day's available energy. Here's what that looks like when applied honestly to a depleted day. Because the temptation on days like this is to demand full performance or declare the whole thing off. Neither is the right move. The right move is to shrink the action, not to skip it. If the modest step from Chapter 7 was sending a message, on a depleted day, the equivalent step might be drafting it without sending, or simply opening the document and typing one sentence. This will feel almost absurdly small, and that reaction is worth resisting rather than obeying, because the absurdly small version is doing something the skipped version can never do. It keeps the identity intact. It keeps you on the record you're building with yourself, someone who shows up even when showing up looks like almost nothing. This matters more than it initially sounds like it should, and it's worth being specific about why. The internal database from Chapter 4 isn't primarily tracking magnitude, it's tracking continuity. A tiny action taken on a depleted day teaches the nervous system something a large action taken on a good day cannot teach it alone, that the pattern holds even when conditions don't favor it, which is precisely the information that makes a pattern trustworthy, rather than merely convenient. Skipping the depleted day, even once, teaches the opposite lesson, that the commitment was conditional after all, dependent on circumstances lining up, which quietly hands the whole arrangement back to the borrowed self described several chapters ago. There's a particular kind of guilt that shows up on days like this, and it deserves to be addressed directly, rather than left to do its damage unexamined. The instinct, on a depleted day, is often to treat the depletion itself as further evidence of failure proof, that the change was never sustainable, that today's low energy is somehow a verdict on the whole effort. This is worth naming as a distortion, because it treats an ordinary, universal feature of human life, some days simply have less in them than others, as a referendum on character. Depletion isn't a moral failing, it's a Tuesday. Treating it as anything more than that is what turns one hard day into an excuse to abandon weeks of real progress. Think of the difference between two people, months into the same kind of change, hitting the same exhausted week. One treats the week as proof the whole thing was fragile, stops entirely, and starts the cycle described back in Chapter 6 all over again, waiting for some future moment when conditions feel more reliable. The other shrinks the action to something almost embarrassingly small, keeps it anyway, and returns to full size the following week without ceremony, without having to relaunch anything, because nothing was actually abandoned. The second person isn't more disciplined. They've simply stopped confusing the size of the action with the integrity of the commitment behind it. What you're building across days like this one isn't a streak in the way the word usually gets used, fragile and dependent on perfection. It's something closer to a floor, a version of the action so minimal it can survive almost any day, including the worst ones, which means the commitment itself becomes something closer to weatherproof. The good days will still produce more. That's fine and expected. But it's the floor, not the ceiling, that determines whether a pattern survives a year rather than a fortnight. Someone rebuilding a fitness habit after years away from it learns this distinction quickly, often the hard way. On the first week they get sick, or the first week work spirals. The version of the plan built on a good week says 45 minutes, 5 days, with real intensity. The version built to survive in actual life includes a 5-minute floor for the worst days, not as an aspiration, but as a guaranteed minimum that requires so little that skipping it becomes harder than doing it. The 5-minute days rarely feel like progress in the moment. Months later, comparing the person who kept the 5-minute floor against the person who treated a bad week as a reason to stop entirely and restart later, the difference isn't close. One of them never actually broke stride, even when the stride got small. The other restarted from zero more than once, each restart costing more motivation than the last, until stopping altogether started to look like the path of least resistance. Today might be one of those days. If it is, the plan doesn't change. Only the size does. You don't need the energy to do it well. You only need enough to do it small. Chapter 10. What happens when someone else is watching? Relational expansion. How other people function as a variable in the process. Not obstacles, not saviors, but part of the equation. Everything described so far has happened largely in private. The phone on the counter, the message drafted and redrafted, the small action taken alone, unobserved. That privacy has been useful. It's allowed the pattern to be examined without the added complication of an audience. But the pattern doesn't stay private forever, and there's a specific moment worth preparing for, because it changes the equation in ways the earlier chapters haven't yet addressed. The moment someone else is watching what you do. Here's what tends to happen the first time real change becomes visible to another person, and it's worth naming honestly rather than idealizing it. The mechanism from Chapter 4, the fast old threat detection system running its assessment in milliseconds, treats social risk as seriously as it treats any other kind, sometimes more seriously. Being seen trying and possibly being seen failing registers as a distinct category of threat, separate from the private version of the same action. This is why a step that felt manageable alone can suddenly feel enormous the moment someone else knows about it. Consider the difference between deciding privately to change something and announcing it to someone who matters to you. The action itself hasn't changed. What's changed is the presence of a witness. And witnesses activate a specific old fear. Not fear of the task, but fear of what it means about you if the task doesn't go the way you said it would. This is worth naming precisely, because it explains a pattern many people have lived through without quite understanding it. Telling no one, so that failure, if it comes, stays invisible and therefore survivable. There's a real cost to that invisibility, though, one worth weighing honestly against the protection it offers. Change attempted entirely alone has no external accountability holding it in place on the depleted days described in the last chapter. It also has no outside witness to the small wins accumulating in the internal database, no one to notice and reflect back that the pattern really is shifting, which matters more than it might seem, because your own perception of your progress is not always reliable from the inside. Isolation protects you from being seen failing. It also, quietly, removes one of the more reliable mechanisms for actually succeeding. Here's a distinction worth making carefully, because the wrong version of this can do real damage. There's a difference between accountability and dependency. Accountability means someone else knows what you're working toward and can reflect it back to you honestly. Dependency means you've quietly made your follow-through contingent on their attention, their approval, their consistent presence, so that the moment they're distracted or absent, the whole structure collapses along with them. The first strengthens the built self described in Chapter 3. The second, however well-intentioned, hands control right back to something outside yourself, which is precisely the pattern this entire journey has been trying to interrupt. Think about how this plays out with the people already in your life, because they are not a blank slate waiting for your announcement. They built expectations around the version of you that existed before this started, and those expectations don't update automatically just because you've changed something internally. Someone who has known you as reliably cautious for a decade will, understandably, need more than a single data point before adjusting their model of who you are. This isn't betrayal, and it isn't a reason to resent them. It's simply how people work, forming impressions slowly and revising them even more slowly, on a timeline that has nothing to do with how fast you've actually changed inside. This creates a specific uncomfortable dynamic worth naming directly, because avoiding the discomfort of naming it doesn't make it easier to navigate. Sometimes the people closest to you will, without meaning any harm, pull toward the old version of you, the one whose patterns were familiar and therefore comfortable, even if those patterns weren't serving you. A joke about how you always say you'll change and never do. A dismissive comment about the new habit delivered lightly, that nonetheless lands with real weight. None of this typically comes from malice. It comes from people's own discomfort with recalibrating a relationship built around a version of you that's shifting under their feet. The response to this isn't to cut people off, and it isn't to explain yourself at length, defending the change as though it required their permission. Both responses give the dynamic more power than it deserves. The more effective response is quieter, and it borrows directly from Chapter 8's approach to internal resistance. You notice the comment, you let it exist without needing to argue it out of existence, and you continue the small, consistent action regardless of whether they've caught up yet to who you're becoming. Their model of you will update eventually, on its own schedule, built from repeated evidence, the same way your own internal database updates. It just runs on a longer timeline than the one running inside you. There's also a quieter, more encouraging side to this relational dimension, worth holding on to alongside the harder parts. The right kind of witness, chosen deliberately rather than defaulted into, can genuinely accelerate what's happening. Someone who simply asks, without judgment, how the small thing went this week gives the internal database an external mirror, one that catches details you might otherwise let slip past unnoticed in the business of an ordinary day. This isn't about needing an audience to matter. It's about recognizing that humans track patterns more reliably when the pattern is witnessed by someone besides themselves, and choosing that witness with the same care you'd choose anything else load-bearing in your life. Consider the difference between telling 10 people about a change and telling one, chosen specifically because they've demonstrated in the past an ability to ask a direct question without turning it into either a lecture or an audition for how supportive they can appear. 10 casual announcements often produce 10 different reactions, some encouraging, some subtly undermining, most forgotten by the people who gave them within a week. One deliberately chosen witness, checked in with regularly, produces something the 10 never could, a consistent low-drama mirror that remembers what you said you were doing 3 weeks ago and asks about it without ceremony. The difference isn't the number of people who know, it's whether any of them were chosen for the specific job of witnessing, rather than simply informed in passing because the news felt too big to keep entirely private. That distinction, chosen versus merely informed, is worth making deliberately, rather than leaving to whoever happens to be nearby when the urge to tell someone arrives. So the pattern from the earlier chapters doesn't stay purely internal for long, and it was never meant to. It moves outward, into rooms with other people in them, some of whom will notice before you expect them to, some of whom will take longer than feels fair. Their pace isn't yours to control. What's yours to control is simpler. And it's the same thing it's been since Chapter 7. The small action continued regardless of who's watching, or whether anyone is watching at all. Chapter 11. Where this started long before you knew its name. Personal archaeology. Where the pattern comes from, and why it survived this long without victim, without villain. Somewhere underneath everything described so far, there's an origin, and it's worth going looking for it now, carefully, not to assign blame, but to finish understanding a mechanism that's been running for longer than the last 11 chapters have covered. Patterns this consistent, this deeply wired, rarely start in adulthood. They start earlier, in circumstances you had no power to choose, built by a much younger version of you doing the only thing available at the time, adapting to survive whatever the environment actually was. Here's what's worth holding on to before going further, because this chapter can go wrong in either direction if approached carelessly. The point isn't to locate a single dramatic event and hand it full responsibility for everything that followed, the way it sometimes gets simplified in the retelling. Most patterns like this one weren't caused by a single moment. They were built the way sediment builds, mentioned back in Chapter 1, from hundreds of small, repeated experiences that taught a young, still-forming nervous system a specific lesson about what happens when you act, want, or ask for something openly. Consider what the borrowed self actually learned, and when. A child who asked for something and was met with unpredictable response, sometimes warmth, sometimes dismissal, with no reliable way to predict which one was coming, learns something efficient and lasting. Better to check first, to read the room, to wait for a signal before acting, because acting without checking carried real, unpredictable cost. That lesson wasn't wrong at the time. It was accurate, adaptive, and quite possibly the smartest available response to an environment that genuinely rewarded caution over spontaneity. The borrowed self wasn't a flaw installed by accident. It was competently built, by a young mind doing exactly what young minds are built to do, out of exactly the material it had available. This reframing matters more than it might initially seem to, because it changes the entire emotional register of the archaeology. You are not uncovering evidence of something broken in you. You're uncovering evidence of something that worked once under conditions that no longer apply. The threat assessment described back in Chapter 4 wasn't malfunctioning when it built this pattern. It was doing its job with total competence, using the only data available to a mind too young to have any other source of information about how the world works. Here's the part worth sitting with honestly, because it's easy to rush past on the way to feeling resolved about all of it. Understanding where a pattern came from doesn't automatically dissolve it, and it would be dishonest to promise that it does. Insight and change are not the same event, however satisfying it feels in the moment to finally connect a present-day habit to a childhood cause. What understanding the origin actually does is something more modest and, in its own way, more useful. It removes the moral weight from the pattern. It stops being evidence of a character flaw and starts being evidence of an old strategy, adopted for good reason, that simply never got formally retired once the reasons stopped applying. Think about the specific mismatch this creates in adult life, because it's worth naming precisely. The environment that built the pattern, whatever it was, is very likely gone. The unpredictable response that taught caution may have belonged to a household that no longer exists in that form. A relationship long since changed or ended. A set of circumstances entirely different from the ones you're navigating now, at your current age, with your current resources and current relationships. But the pattern itself doesn't automatically know its original context has changed. It keeps running the old rule against a new environment, checking for a danger that, in most of today's actual moments, isn't really there anymore. This is worth connecting back to the internal database from Chapter 4, because it clarifies exactly what the small, repeated actions described in the middle chapters have actually been doing this whole time. Every modest step taken despite the fear isn't only building new confidence, it's slowly, patiently correcting a data set that's been running on outdated information since a much earlier version of your life. You're not fighting the child who built the pattern. You're updating the file they left behind, using evidence they never had access to, because the world they were adapting to no longer exists in the form that shaped them. There's a particular kind of relief available here, worth naming because it's easy to miss under the weight of the archaeology itself. This isn't about excusing the pattern forever because of where it came from, using the origin as a permanent justification for staying stuck. It's the opposite. Once a pattern is understood as an old, outdated adaptation rather than a permanent character trait, it becomes something that can be updated rather than something that has to be endured. Traits feel fixed. Adaptations, by definition, adapt. The distinction between those two words is doing an enormous amount of work here, more than it might first appear to. It can help to look at a specific, ordinary version of this rather than staying entirely in the abstract. Someone who grew up in a house where a parent's mood shifted without warning learns, early and efficiently, to read a room before speaking in it, to test the emotional temperature before asking for anything, to keep their own needs small enough not to add unpredictability to an already unpredictable environment. Decades later, that same person finds themselves reading a manager's mood before raising a legitimate concern, softening a reasonable request until it barely resembles a request at all, apologizing before making an ask that needed no apology whatsoever. The manager's office is not the childhood living room. The stakes are not remotely the same. But the old detection system doesn't know that automatically because nobody ever told it, in a language it could use, that the environment changed. Telling it patiently through repeated evidence that this particular room does not punish direct requests the way the old one sometimes did, is the entire unglamorous work of updating an old adaptation into one that fits the life actually being lived now. No blame belongs anywhere in this chapter, not toward whoever or whatever shaped the original environment, and not toward the version of you that built the pattern in response to it. Both were working with what they had. The environment wasn't necessarily cruel. It may simply have been inconsistent, distracted, human in the ordinary ways that most environments are. And the pattern that formed in response wasn't weakness. It was intelligence, applied early, doing precisely what it needed to do to keep a young, dependent person safe inside conditions they had no power to choose or change. What's different now is simple, and it's the only thing that actually needed to be different. You're not that young anymore. You have resources that version of you didn't have the ability to leave rooms, to choose relationships, to survive rejection in ways that once felt genuinely dangerous and no longer are. The pattern hasn't caught up to that fact yet. But it can. It just needed you to finally go looking for where it started. Chapter 12. Why Progress Disappears Without a Structure. Fragility of progress. Why we slide back, and how to protect the gains already made. There's a specific kind of disappearance worth naming here, because it happens to almost everyone who's made it this far. And it happens quietly enough that most people don't notice it until the progress is already largely gone. Weeks pass. The small actions from Chapter 7, still happening, start to feel automatic. And then, without any single dramatic reversal, without the resistance from Chapter 8 showing up in any obvious form, the whole pattern simply fades, not through failure but through forgetting. Until one ordinary morning you notice the phone is face down on the counter again, and you're not entirely sure when that started happening. This deserves careful attention because it's genuinely different from the resistance and depletion covered in earlier chapters, and treating it the same way won't work. Resistance announces itself, however subtly. Depletion is at least felt, even if its cause takes a moment to name. This third failure mode doesn't announce anything. It simply lets consistency erode through the ordinary friction of a life that keeps generating new demands, new distractions, new things that feel urgent enough to justify skipping today, just today, this once. Here's the mechanism worth understanding, because it explains why this particular failure mode is so much harder to catch than the others. Early progress runs on visible motivation, the excitement of the first small win, the relief of finally moving after the paralysis described back in Chapter 1. That motivation is real, but it's also, by its nature, temporary. It was never designed to last indefinitely, and expecting it to is what sets up the eventual disappearance. Motivation gets you started. It was never going to be the thing that kept you going for a year. What replaces motivation, in every pattern that actually survives past its first excited weeks, is structure, something external to your daily feelings, built once, that doesn't require you to reconstruct your commitment from scratch every single morning. This is worth distinguishing clearly from the discipline versus fidelity conversation back in Chapter 9, because it's related, but not identical. Fidelity is the internal decision to act regardless of feeling. Structure is the external scaffolding that makes fidelity easier to sustain over time, reducing how much internal decision-making is required on any given day. Consider what structure actually looks like in practice, because the word can sound abstract until it's made concrete. It might be a specific time of day, the same time, attached to an existing habit so the new action doesn't require a fresh decision each time about when it happens. It might be a simple, visible record, nothing elaborate, just a mark on a calendar each time the small action occurs, so that the pattern becomes something you can see accumulating, rather than something you have to trust is happening from memory alone. The specific mechanism matters less than what it accomplishes, removing the daily requirement to decide, from scratch, whether today is a day the pattern continues. Here's why this matters more than it might initially seem to. Every additional decision required in a day draws from the same limited reserve, the one already stretched thin by ordinary adult life. A pattern that requires fresh motivation and a fresh decision every single day is a pattern competing, every single day, against everything else demanding that same limited reserve. A pattern anchored to structure instead competes far less, because much of the decision has already been made in advance. The way the response to the signal was preloaded back in Chapter 7. Structure isn't a replacement for the internal commitment. It's what keeps the commitment from having to be rebuilt from nothing, daily, indefinitely. There's a particular trap worth naming here, because it catches people who've genuinely internalized the earlier chapters and, ironically, that internalization is what makes them vulnerable to it. Having understood that identity matters more than motivation, that fidelity beats discipline, some people conclude that structure is unnecessary, a crutch for people who haven't yet built the internal commitment strongly enough. This gets the relationship backward. Structure isn't evidence of insufficient internal commitment. It's what protects internal commitment from the ordinary erosion of an actual life, full of legitimate competing demands that have nothing to do with how genuinely committed you are. Think about the shape this erosion typically takes, because recognizing the shape in advance is most of what prevents it. It rarely looks like a decision to quit. It looks like one skipped day that felt fully justified given the circumstances, followed by a second skipped day that felt like a natural continuation of the first, followed by a gradual redefinition of what normal even means, until the skipped version has quietly become the new baseline, without anyone formally deciding it should. By the time this becomes visible, weeks or months of progress have often unwound, not because the underlying change wasn't real, but because nothing was in place to catch the first slip before it became a second one. This is where the visible record mentioned earlier does some of its most important work. A gap in an otherwise consistent record is uncomfortable to look at in a way that a purely internal sense of having let something slide often isn't. That discomfort isn't a design flaw. It's the entire point. It creates a small specific pressure to close the gap quickly, rather than let it widen, catching the pattern at one skipped day instead of 30, which is the difference between a minor correction and a full restart from Chapter 1. None of this requires elaborate systems, and it's worth resisting the instinct toward premature complexity described back in Chapter 6, where an elaborate plan becomes its own form of avoidance. The structure that actually protects progress tends to be almost boring in its simplicity. A consistent time, a visible mark, a small and specific way of noticing when a gap has opened. What it lacks in sophistication, it makes up for in the one quality that actually matters here. It keeps working on the days when motivation, understandably, doesn't show up on its own. Consider two versions of the same person trying to maintain a writing habit. One relies entirely on remembering to feel motivated each evening, and by the third week, evenings have quietly filled up with other things that felt more urgent in the moment. The other ties the habit to something already fixed in the day, immediately after the first coffee, before any email gets opened, and keeps a plain paper calendar with an X marked after each session. The second version isn't more talented or more committed in any deep sense. They simply remove the daily requirement to decide, from a position of already depleted willpower, whether tonight was a writing night. The X on the calendar did more work than any amount of enthusiasm ever could, precisely because it asked nothing of the day's limited motivation to keep functioning. The progress you've built across these chapters is real. It is also, without something holding it in place, exactly as fragile as any other unstructured thing left to the ordinary erosion of daily life. Structure is what makes it last long enough to become who you are, rather than something you did for a while. Chapter 13. Who You're Becoming, One Action at a Time. The identity mechanism. Who the listener is becoming, action by action, without yet noticing the shift. Something has been happening underneath everything described so far, quietly enough that it's worth stopping to name directly before continuing any further. Every small action from Chapter 7, every modest repetition through the depleted days of Chapter 9, every gap closed before it widened in Chapter 12. None of it was only producing outcomes. It was producing something else at the same time, something less visible, and in the long run, more consequential than any single result. It was producing a self. Here's the distinction worth making precisely, because it reframes everything that's come before it. Most people think of identity as something they discover, a fixed truth about who they really are, waiting to be uncovered through enough introspection or the right insight. That's not how it actually works, and the chapters so far have already demonstrated the alternative without naming it outright. Identity isn't discovered. It's constructed, action by action, the same way a reputation gets built, not through a single declaration, but through an accumulating pattern of evidence that eventually becomes difficult to argue with, including for the person living inside it. Consider what this means about the phone on the counter mornings from Chapter 1, now viewed from further along the path. Each time the borrowed self won that quiet, private election, it wasn't only costing you the specific opportunity in front of you. It was casting a vote for a particular identity, the version of you who waits, who checks conditions first, who needs permission before acting. And each vote made the next vote easier to cast the same way, not because anything was proven about your true nature, but because a self was being built, ballot by ballot, out of nothing more mysterious than repetition. This is worth sitting with because it applies with equal force in the other direction, which is the entire point of naming it now. Every small action taken since Chapter 7 has been casting a different vote, not proof of a dramatic transformation, and not evidence of some newly discovered true self finally emerging. Just another ballot, cast for a slightly different identity than the one that used to win by default. The message sent instead of redrafted a fifth time. The small step taken on the depleted day instead of skipped. Each one, on its own, negligible. Together, across weeks, they constitute something with actual weight. Here's what makes this mechanism worth understanding at the level of precision this chapter is aiming for, rather than as a vague motivational idea. There's a specific tipping point in how any repeated action gets processed by the mind, and it's worth naming clearly. Early on, an action feels like something you're doing effortful, deliberate, requiring conscious choice each time. Past a certain threshold of repetition, something shifts, and the same action starts to feel like something you simply are no longer a decision requiring will, but a reflection of identity requiring nothing but continuation. That shift, from doing to being, is the entire mechanism this journey has been building toward since Chapter 1. Think about a skill you already possess fully, one so integrated you no longer experience it as effort. There was a version of you once, learning that skill deliberately, consciously, correcting mistakes with real concentration. At some point, without a single dramatic moment marking the transition, the skill stopped requiring that conscious effort and simply became part of how you move through the world. Nobody announces the exact day a practiced action becomes an identity. It happens gradually, and it's usually only visible in retrospect, the way you might notice you no longer think about which hand holds the fork. This is precisely what's been happening quietly since the earlier chapters, and it's worth being honest about where in that process you likely stand right now. If you've been applying what the last several chapters described, you are somewhere in the middle of that shift, no longer purely in the effortful, doing phase, not yet fully into the effortless, being phase. This middle stretch is its own kind of uncomfortable, and it deserves acknowledgement rather than impatience. The old identity hasn't fully released its grip. The new one hasn't fully solidified its claim. You are, in a very real sense, between selves, and that particular discomfort has its own name worth knowing. Call it identity lag, and understand it as a normal, temporary feature of exactly this stage, not a sign that anything has gone wrong. Your actions have already started producing a new pattern of evidence. Your internal sense of who you are hasn't fully caught up to that evidence yet, because self-concept updates more slowly than behavior does, the same way a friend's model of you updates more slowly than your own internal changes, as covered back in Chapter 10. This gap will close. It closes through nothing more complicated than continuation, the accumulated weight of more votes cast in the new direction than the old one, until the new identity simply outweighs the old evidence and becomes, without ceremony, the default. There's a specific kind of quiet confidence available to you now that wasn't available back in Chapter 1, and it's worth naming precisely rather than letting it stay vague. It isn't the confidence of feeling certain about outcomes, which was never realistic and was never actually the goal. It's the confidence of having enough accumulated evidence, built through your own repeated actions rather than borrowed from anyone else's opinion, that a specific, quieter kind of knowing becomes available. This is simply what I do now. Not a hope, not an aspiration stated in future tense, a description of an already forming present fact, verified the same way any fact gets verified, through repetition observed over time. There's a useful way to picture how slowly this shift actually announces itself, borrowed from something as ordinary as a bank statement. Nobody checks their balance after a single $5 deposit expecting to feel rich. The deposit matters only in the context of every other deposit made before it, invisible individually, undeniable in aggregate once enough of them have accumulated. Identity works on the same principle, and expecting any single action to feel like a turning point is expecting a single deposit to feel like wealth. It won't, not because the action didn't matter, but because that was never how accumulation announces itself. It shows up later, all at once, in a moment that feels sudden only because nobody was watching closely enough in the meantime to see the total quietly climbing, one modest and forgettable deposit after another, each one insignificant alone, each one indispensable together. You are not the same person who stood in that kitchen back in Chapter 1. phone face down on the counter, coffee going cold. Not because anything dramatic happened in a single moment, and not because some hidden true self was finally uncovered. Because a different self was built, quietly, through choices too small to notice individually, and now stands where the old one used to stand by default. That self isn't waiting for a final confirmation before it counts as real. It has already been voted into place, one modest action at a time. Chapter 14. Everything fits together now. Consolidation. Every piece as one coherent, usable system. It's worth stepping back now, far enough to see the whole shape of what's actually been built across these chapters, because up close, each piece looked like its own separate lesson, and it's easy to lose track of how completely they fit together into a single, usable mechanism. It started with a moment small enough to be easy to dismiss, a phone face down on a counter, a message unsent, a hesitation that felt too ordinary to matter. That moment turned out to be the entire pattern in miniature, the place where a quiet, private election happened between two versions of you, one built through years of acting despite doubt, the other running on borrowed permission it kept waiting to receive from outside itself. Most mornings, without ceremony, the second one had been winning. Underneath that morning sat a habit of not quite noticing, examined honestly in Chapter 2, not ignorance, but a managed truth, kept just out of full view because full view comes with an invoice attached. And underneath that sat the actual mechanism doing the managing, opened up in Chapter 4, a fast old threat detection system, running its assessment in milliseconds, working from a database built years before the present moment had any chance to update it. That mechanism came from somewhere specific, and Chapter 11 went looking for it without assigning blame to anyone, including the young version of you who built it in the first place, competently, out of the only material available at the time. The pattern wasn't a flaw. It was an intelligent adaptation to conditions that, in most cases, no longer exist, still running its old rule against a life that outgrew the reasons for it a long time ago. Naming the mechanism honestly meant facing its actual cost. In Chapter 5, not the rounded-down version, but the full number, counted in identity rather than only in missed events, and understanding why previous attempts to change it hadn't held in Chapter 6, meant recognizing that the earlier efforts weren't failures of willpower. They were aimed at the wrong layer, behavior instead of mechanism, all at once instead of in small, survivable increments. From there, the actual working method took shape, piece by piece, each one solving a specific failure mode the others couldn't reach alone. Chapter 7 supplied the first real movement. One signal, identified honestly. One response decided calmly in advance. One action small enough to survive contact with fear that never needed defeating first. Chapter 8 prepared you for what rises the moment that movement starts working resistance, escalating precisely because it's threatened, arguing its case in language that borrows the sound of wisdom without earning the substance of it. Chapter 9 handled the days when none of it feels available, teaching the difference between discipline, which depletes, and fidelity, which doesn't, and showing that the size of the action matters less than whether it survives the day intact. Chapter 10 widened the frame outward, into rooms with other people in them, distinguishing accountability that strengthens from dependency that quietly undermines, and preparing you for the specific uncomfortable lag between who you're becoming and how long it takes the people around you to notice. Chapter 12 caught the failure mode that doesn't announce itself at all, the quiet erosion of a pattern nobody consciously abandoned, prevented not through more motivation but through structure, the boring external scaffolding that removes the daily requirement to rebuild commitment from nothing. And Chapter 13 named what all of it had actually been building the entire time, underneath the visible outcomes. Not just better results, but a different self, constructed vote by vote, through repetition too small to notice individually and too consistent over time to argue with. Here's what becomes visible only now, with the full shape in view, that couldn't be seen from inside any single chapter on its own. This was never a list of separate techniques to apply independently, chosen according to whichever chapter title matched the day's particular struggle. It's a single mechanism, viewed from different angles, at different points along its actual operation. The signal happens. The threat assessment runs, using an old database. The small action, decided in advance, either interrupts that database or confirms it further. Resistance may rise, and it gets outlasted, not argued with. Depletion may arrive, and the action shrinks rather than stops. Structure holds the whole thing in place across the ordinary erosion of days that don't cooperate, and underneath all of it, invisibly, a new identity accumulates, one vote at a time, and until it becomes the thing that answers the phone by default. There's a question worth asking directly at this point, because it's probably been forming somewhere in the background across the last several chapters, whether or not it's been said outright. Does this ever finish? Does the mechanism ever fully retire, leaving behind a version of you who no longer needs any of this, who acts purely from settled identity with no remaining trace of the old threat assessment underneath? The honest answer is more useful than a comforting one would be. The old mechanism doesn't disappear entirely, and expecting it to disappear is its own kind of setup for disappointment. What changes isn't the presence of the signal, or the occasional flicker of the old threat assessment running in the background. What changes is which self answers it, how quickly, and how much weight the old response still carries once it arrives. The kitchen counter moment may still show up, occasionally, even years from now. It simply won't mean what it used to mean, because the identity built to meet it will no longer be the one running on borrowed permission by default. What you have now isn't a finished project. It's a working system, assembled piece by piece across 14 chapters, each one supplying something the others couldn't provide alone. It doesn't require perfect execution, and nothing in it was ever designed to. It requires only what it's required since Chapter 7. The next small action, decided in advance, taken regardless of how ready you feel when the moment actually arrives. It's worth being honest, too, about what this system does not promise, because false promises tend to collapse the first time reality contradicts them. It doesn't promise a life free of hesitation, free of hard mornings, free of the occasional relapse into checking conditions before acting. What it promises is narrower, and for that reason, more trustworthy. A way of recognizing the pattern quickly enough to interrupt it. A floor small enough to survive the worst days. A structure sturdy enough to catch the first slip before it becomes 30. And an identity, slowly outweighing the old one, that makes the whole apparatus require less and less conscious maintenance over time. That's a more modest promise than most books in this genre make. It's also, unlike most of those promises, one that has already been tested, chapter by chapter, against an actual life rather than an idealized one, on ordinary days, under ordinary pressure, without waiting for conditions to become convenient first. Everything necessary is already in place. What comes next isn't a new lesson. It's simply what you do with what you've already built. Chapter 15. What remains? When the waiting stops. The anchor of retention. The open loop closes, not suspense certainty. Arrived at, earned. There's a morning worth returning to now, the same one that opened this entire journey, because it's the only way to see clearly how much has actually shifted. 6:47. A phone on the counter, a message typed, a cursor blinking at the end of a sentence read 4 times. That morning was never really about the message. It was about which self would answer first. And for a long time, the answer wasn't yours to choose. It simply happened, the way weather happens, while you stood inside it calling it a personality. Picture that same morning now, not as a memory, but as a template. And notice what's actually different when it plays out again. the signal still arrives. It always will. Chapter 14 was honest about that. And honesty is worth keeping all the way through to the end. But the gap between the signal and the response has changed shape entirely. Where there used to be a long, unexamined slide into hesitation, there is now a decision already made, sitting quietly in place, waiting for nothing further from you, except permission to run. Here is the sentence from the very beginning of this journey, worth hearing again now that it has somewhere to land. The question was never what you do with your time. It was what you do with what's left of you after the time runs out. That sentence was designed to unsettle, deliberately, before it had earned the right to resolve. It sounded on first hearing like a warning about waste, about hours spent poorly, about a ledger running out before you'd used it well. That reading isn't wrong. It's simply incomplete. And completing it is the entire purpose of this final chapter. What's left of you after the time runs out was never a measure of hours. It was a measure of self specifically, which self remained standing once the easy excuses, the borrowed permissions, the waiting for readiness that never arrived on its own, had all been stripped away by nothing more dramatic than years passing. Two people can spend an identical number of hours on this earth and arrive at entirely different answers to what's left of them at the end, because the hours were never the variable that mattered. The self doing the spending was. This is where the two selves named back in Chapter 3 finally receive their full weight. The borrowed self spends time waiting for conditions that validate action in advance, and what's left of a person who spends decades that way is, unavoidably, a person still waiting, only older, with less time remaining to do anything but wait further. The built self spends time acting from decided identity, gathering evidence with each small movement, the way described across every chapter since the 7th, and what's left of a person who spends decades that way is someone who has, slowly and without ceremony, become the person the waiting was always meant to lead toward. Here's what makes this a resolution, rather than another observation added to a pile of insights. You are not required to guess which kind of remainder you're accumulating. The evidence has already been generated, chapter by chapter, action by action, since the first small message got sent, instead of redrafted a 5th time. The internal database from Chapter 4 has new entries in it now that weren't there when this began. The identity lag from Chapter 13 has been closing quietly, the way it always closes, through nothing more mysterious than continued repetition outweighing old data. You already know, if you've been honest across these pages, which self has been showing up more often lately when the phone lights up and a decision is required. There's a specific kind of quiet, worth naming precisely because it's different from anything promised earlier in this journey. It isn't the excitement of Chapter 7's first movement, and it isn't the relief of Chapter 8's resistance finally losing its grip for a day. It's steadier than both of those, less dramatic and more permanent. It's the particular calm that belongs to someone who no longer needs external proof that they're capable of acting, because the proof has already been generated privately through months of small, unglamorous repetition that nobody else was watching and that never needed an audience to count. Consider what changes practically once that calm settles in for good. The kitchen counter morning stops being a referendum on your entire character and becomes, simply, a morning. The message gets sent or it doesn't, and either way, the outcome no longer carries the weight of deciding who you fundamentally are, because that question isn't open anymore. It's already been answered, not through a single declaration, but through the accumulated weight of hundreds of ordinary mornings where the built self quietly showed up. This is the actual shape of what this entire journey has been offering, from the very first paragraph, before the book's ideas had even been named. Not a technique, not a system to maintain forever through effort and vigilance. A permanent shift in which self answers by default, built the only way anything like that has ever actually been built, through small, repeated, unglamorous evidence, gathered patiently until the new identity simply weighs more than the old one and the outcome stops being in question. There's a version of you, somewhere ahead, who will face a moment much like this one. A signal, a hesitation, a fork between two familiar selves. That version won't need to remember this chapter or any of the 14 before it, the way you might need to remember a technique. The mechanism will already be who they are by then, running quietly beneath conscious thought, the way any deeply practiced thing eventually runs. That's what it looks like when a pattern finishes the journey from doing to being, the shift named back in Chapter 13, finally complete. There's no ceremony required to mark this, and it's worth saying plainly so the absence of one doesn't get mistaken for absence of change. Nothing about today needs to look different from yesterday for what's being described here to be true. The shift was never going to announce itself with fireworks, the same way the identity described in Chapter 13 never announced its own arrival, the same way the internal database from Chapter 4 never sent a formal notice that its calibration had finally updated. It simply, quietly became true, the way most durable things become true. Through accumulation, nobody was watching closely enough to notice happening in real time until one ordinary morning the old question simply stopped being asked, because it had already, somewhere along the way, been answered. What's left of you in the end was never going to be decided by the hours. It was going to be decided by which self kept showing up inside them, morning after ordinary morning, long after anyone else was watching, long after it stopped feeling like effort and simply became who you were. That question is no longer open. You already answered it. One small action at a time, exactly the way every real answer has ever actually been given.